Wonderful. Well, thank you for inviting me, Denise, to this pop-up chat this morning. Um, I have a bit of a kind of distant relationship to the Plexus Institute. Jeffrey Goldstein, who I'll mention a few times during the chat this morning, was actually 10 years ago. I know he was on the scientific advisory committee for the Plexus Institute, and Jeffrey was my examiner for my PhD thesis. I had two examiners. I had Jeffrey, which picked up the complexity part, and then I had Alex Nichols from Oxford University, who picked up the social innovation, social entrepreneurship part. So I do feel like I've got a connection to Plexus for many years. What I want to talk about this morning is I want to introduce the idea of the link between complexity theory and social innovation. And I want to look at the link between complexity theory and social entrepreneurship. But I'm going to delve further into social entrepreneurship and look at not only a complexity approach to social entrepreneurship, but 4 other approaches to social entrepreneurship, which are not complexity approaches, but I think they are important to have in mind when taking a complexity approach as well. So I hope you can see me, because I've kind of like gone blank on my screen for some reason. So is everything all right there? Can you hear me all right, Denise? Yep, I'm getting a head nodding. So looking at social innovation in general, it's actually about just coming up with new ideas that work to address social issues. And traditionally, for traditional types of like complicated problems, we do that through the development of services and products and processes. And it's a very planning, like it's a predetermined solution type of approach to actually developing that kind of social innovation. And we use tools like logic models and theories of change that we can use to actually be able to develop those types of social innovations. Now, that's different than the complexity approach to social innovation. And Jeffrey Goldstein defines this complexity approach as a shift from an original attractor, which represents business as usual, to a new attractor, which represents the social innovation. So these attractors are really about patterns of working, about boundaries of behaviour. And from a complexity perspective, social innovation focuses on creating these new patterns of behaviour in systems. Going back in 2012, there was an interesting report that came out of the Social Innovation Europe project on systems innovation. In that report, it actually recognised the importance of understanding complex adaptive systems and complexity thinking to do this kind of work. And it said that taking a systems innovation approach was what was required if we were to address complex, wicked problems. And so how they defined systemic innovation was a set of interconnected innovations where each is dependent on the other, with innovation both in the parts of the system and in the ways that they interact. And so they saw that kind of innovation was what was important to address wicked problems. And when you think of complex, wicked problems, they consist of a multitude of underpinning causal factors that are interrelated. And so what they're actually saying is that for that kind of problem, you need a similar approach. You need the same level of complexity for addressing them as the complexity of those kinds of problems. And they're the kinds of problems like poverty and climate change, place-based disadvantage, obesity. Lots of underpinning causal factors, and they're intertwined. There's all these positive and negative feedback loops of this kind of problem. And so if you went to address it by throwing a project or a product or a service at it, you'd only be addressing a few of those causal factors. And what would happen is you could have unforeseen consequences in other parts of the problem. So that's why they're kind of like saying that this is the required approach. Another interesting report came out from Deloitte's University in 2015, which looked at, they classed them as wicked opportunities and going after wicked opportunities. And they were saying that it was a similar approach that was required. And they were calling this a solution ecosystem approach for addressing these wicked problems. And a solution ecosystem approach, once again, a solution ecosystem for a particular wicked problem in a particular geographical area consists of all of the initiatives that are addressing any of the underpinning causal factors, and all of the organisations that are partnering on those initiatives. So you're actually got this ecosystem of a wicked problem with all of these causal factors, and you're addressing it with this ecosystem of initiatives that are addressing any of those underpinning factors. So it's like a system of causal factors is the problem, and then you've got this system of initiatives that are addressing that large problem. And so I guess that's what, from a complexity perspective, that's the kind of areas we're playing with regards to social innovation. Collective impact, taking a complexity approach, and the second report that came out from Kania and Cramia was actually on emergence and highlighted that collective impact was never meant to be about predetermined solutions, and it was about creating these conditions for emergence. So social innovation from a complexity perspective, that's the kind of work that we focus on. With regards to social entrepreneurship, because I'm going to talk about 5 different perspectives of what social entrepreneurship is, and from that you can see that defining social entrepreneurship is quite tricky, because people think of it in lots of different ways, and so it's, as a field, it's spent around 20 years trying to define itself, and in the end kind of like just given up really. But what it's really about, it's about execution. So it's about what you need. So you might have this social innovation, but like, well, what does it look like on the ground? So social entrepreneurship, if I had to think of it broadly, it's about execution. It's about how you bring your resources together in an environment to go after an opportunity, how you manage the risks to actually get things on the ground. And from a complexity perspective, social entrepreneurship is seen as a transition approach. So it's seen as being able to move from it's being able to move from one state to another state, and how do you actually do that for a system? So it's about execution. How do you actually do that? How do you actually do that transition? How do you what kind of conditions do you need to create for transitions is really the focus, rather than products or services or processes. It's really about those transitions. And that's why I've been hanging with the urban planning people as well, because they're very into transitions from a complexity perspective. There's for the urban planning folk, they've got an organisation called the Association of European Schools of Planning, and one of their largest network groups is their complexity stream, and they are into this idea of transitions. And so for addressing wicked problems, is recognise that you need to take a complexity approach when addressing this kind of problems, and so this idea of social entrepreneurship and complexity has come through. Once again, Jeffrey Goldstein and Jim Hazy from Adelphi University really brought this to the fore, and they actually say that the work in this area of social entrepreneurship and complexity builds upon leadership studies and complexity theory. And so they've taken the work that's happened in leadership studies and complexity theory, and they've translated that over to social entrepreneurship. And for my own PhD, what I actually did is I looked at 4 different complex systems leadership theories and translated that to a way of managing transitions in communities when addressing wicked problems. The reason why I think it's important to think about the other forms of social entrepreneurship is because what we're actually doing in communities is we're transitioning all of the players who are addressing any of the component parts as one system to a new way of working. And in recent years, I've come to the realisation, I was heavily involved in social enterprises and social entrepreneurship for many years, then worked out that couldn't really achieve systems change, focusing on these individual initiatives, so moved over to systems approaches. And then I've had this realisation that shifting those ways of working of whole systems of players and initiatives to a new state, that's only really going to be as strong as what those initiatives are in the first place as well. So it's kind of like being able to look at it at both levels. It's like the transition of all of that's really important, but also the strength of those individual initiatives is really important as well. So there's 4, besides the complexity approach to social entrepreneurship, there's 4 other approaches. There's 2 from the United States. There's a social enterprise school and a social innovation school. The social innovation school, as the name states, the focus is on social innovation. It came from the fellow who started the Ashoka Institute. And the focus is on creating new ways to solve problems and the big challenges. So that was his focus, and that was the 1980s. But at the same time, there's another fellow called Ed Skloot that started a consultancy firm that looked at non-profits earning income, and so that's the social enterprise school. And then in Europe, there's another 2 schools of thought. One is focused more on mutuals. So this is mainland Europe, has got more of a focus on collectives and mutuals. And that's really where the word social in social entrepreneurship, in that way of thinking, is really about social connections more than social problems. And so in the early days, that mainland Europe's focus was that. And then in the UK, the focus was really on community building, and it came from their welfare reform processes, and that's the same as Australia. The focus is on welfare reform. So I guess my work these days sees the importance of strengthening the initiatives in communities and then focusing on the transition of these ecosystems of initiatives to a more coherent state, which are more effective at addressing the wicked problem. So that's really what I wanted to introduce this morning, was this idea with regards to how we think about complexity in social innovation and social entrepreneurship, and then to just introduce the conference, the International Social Innovation Research Conference, and the stream, the Social Innovation and Complexity stream. And once again, Jeffrey Goldstein had a lot to do with that as well. So in 2008, at Adelphi University, they held a conference on social entrepreneurship, systems thinking and complexity in 2008 at Adelphi University. Then in 2009, they came over to the International Social Innovation Research Conference. In that particular year, I remember it was being held at Oxford, and they presented on how social entrepreneurship was really about. I think the name of their presentation was "Social Entrepreneurship Has Complexity Written All Over It." And then in 2010, they held another social entrepreneurship, systems thinking and complexity conference at Adelphi University. And I attended that one because I was so inspired by their presentation. at the 2009 conference. Unfortunately, they never went on to run any more of these conferences from Adelphi University, but they did spark a lot of interest within the International Social Innovation Research Conference. And a colleague and I decided that we really wanted to, we were kind of like going from stream to stream at this conference looking for papers on complexity. So we put forward in 2007, the conference was held in Australia, and we asked if we could have a complexity stream. And I think that year we had the second highest level of amount of papers of any of the streams, the first year we ran it. The first year we ran it, the papers were quite diverse, and we kind of looked at each other and said, oh my God, is that really complexity? Which really made us think about, do we want a big tent or a little tent? And so we kind of like looked at how we define it with regards to descriptive and perceived complexity, and we can talk about that in the chat if you want to unpack that some more. Last year they were more, the conference, the papers we had last year were more of that descriptive complexity, that really seeing more use of complexity theory in the papers. And I've written down some of the titles of the papers so we can have a look at those if you wanted to unpack that as well. So the call for papers is currently open for next year's conference, which is going to be held in Glasgow, which is lovely. I've fortunately been to Glasgow a couple of times, and it's always a great place to hold a conference. Putting in a proposal for an abstract, putting in an abstract is not onerous. It's only like 300 words, and that doesn't include references. What they're actually asking, so the abstract's closed 28th of February. They're saying on the call for papers that the abstract should articulate the research objectives or questions that are being addressed, the conceptual or theoretical perspectives informing the work, which most of us will be complexity theory, where appropriate, the methodology utilised, so if you are doing research, the contribution of the paper to knowledge in light of the conference theme. And this year the conference theme is social innovation, local solutions to global challenges, which fits really nicely with a complexity perspective. I could talk for hours, but I'm not going to. I'm going to hand it back over to Denise if you wanted to if you wanted to ask some questions or ask others to ask questions, and we can start having a bit of a chat. What do you think?
I think that's terrific, and thank you. Yes, I could listen for hours, so and I think everybody else here could as well. But
Thank you.
Several things. One, I'd like to open this up for anybody who has a particular question about the conference, but even more importantly, is there work that folks on the pop-up or in the pop-up are doing that are at the intersections of the social innovation and complexity, and how are you sort of addressing it? So I do know some of the folks on the call, but others I don't. So that's really always terrific. And as sort of an intro to that, one of the things that we've been doing at Plexus is trying to sort of loosen the boundaries or open up the boundaries and constraints between purely academic approaches and what I will call sort of really practice orientation. So my question for you, Sharon, and then maybe for others who are on the pop-up is that an opportunity or possibility for papers to have it be more of a practice? We call it practice, learning and complexity in action. So case studies, practice, things that are in what I will call the experimental proof of concept state.
Definitely, and it's quite interesting that a lot of the people that are in the stream are practitioners that have got a foot in both camps. So they've got a foot so they've either got social enterprises, or they're actually working as an intermediary with regards to assisting between. So it's really interesting that it's very practice-based. in my own work, I'm into commercialization of research, and we've kind of like developed this kind of business model where I do the research, I write the paper, and at the same time develop the product. We've got the initiative on the ground at the same time that the paper gets published. So if I can't use it in practice, I'd be bored. So I'm a practitioner. I've got two enterprises myself. I've co-founded a software company with a colleague that focuses on transitions, and I've got another leadership type program where I embed leadership programs in local government with regards to active citizens, etc. And so all of the work and all of my research has been tracking real life. I haven't done anything except for last year at the conference. I presented part of a paper which I couldn't finish off because it was too theoretical for me, which I was looking at mapping the field, which was just amazing. But we are progressing with that. We're actually about to do a special issue of emergence, complexity and organisation from papers from the first conference, and we're putting a bit of that up front with regards to, okay, how do we map this with regards to what are people are working on in this field. But definitely, I'm a practitioner at heart. You know what I mean? But it's funny. I go to practitioner conferences and I say I'm a practitioner, and I think, oh, I am a bit theoretical. But then I'll go to theory conferences and I think, no, I'm a practitioner. So yeah, I like both.
So one of the things that I've noticed is, Mike Taylor from Maryland, I'm also part of Plexus, is that I found that some academics who are interested in complexity and truly understand it and want to use it to create social innovation are feeling constrained themselves by the academic environment, by the push to produce papers, by the push for other kind of what they view as non-value work.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
There's even academics are finding that they feel constrained by that academic environment. Although it has its benefits, it also seems to be constraining, and there's almost like an unintentional conspiracy between practitioners and academics that I think is developing to push the field forward.
It's really interesting because I've got two academic relationships. I've got an adjunct position with the University of South Australia, and I've lectured for 10 years in social entrepreneurship with the University of Adelaide, but I've never been employed. So I've got this adjunct position at this one university, and the other university contracts one of my businesses. And I come in and deliver their program. So I don't do meetings, and so they get the points from my papers, which I don't know how the points thing happens with regards to other universities. There's some kind of points thing when I publish, but I've got no one controlling what I do, and I haven't worked for an employer since 2005. So I feel very fortunate. Because I do attend a lot of academic conferences internationally. I would say on average probably 6 or 7 international conferences a year, but my business funds them all. So I've kind of like been in a position where I'm able to do a lot more, I think, than traditional academics, because I don't have to, I've got no one looking over what I do. It's the perfect world. I feel very fortunate. So I don't know if there's, I see Robert there waving hand.
I don't mean to, excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt. If you were finishing a thought, please do.
Yeah.
So you covered so much ground. There's so much juicy stuff to talk about. But one thing that came to mind was I worked for a for-profit in the past. I worked for a for-profit design firm that was running a social innovation systems change project for a national philanthropy in the US, the Kellogg Foundation. And they're trying to do national scale systems change. And I was a new employee at the firm that I was working for, and I was really impressed at how they were able to scale up their kind of like design thinking, design methods to meet the scale of the challenge. But there was a point where we just got stuck. And I felt like we just didn't have the conceptual tools. It was a combination of having the right conceptual tools and kind of existentially shaping the thing correctly. I finally came to the conclusion that the philanthropy couldn't own this thing we were creating. Like, it just wouldn't be possible. But anyway, what I wanted to jump to was I looked at a bunch of different high-level structures for dealing with stuff that's that complex. And I remember I looked at the chaotic stuff and Visa and DHOC. There are a couple other things that came to mind. I kind of like triangulated, and one of the things that popped up that helped me then, and I've kind of dragged it along since, is shaping strategy from John Seeley Brown and John Hagel. They run something, I believe, the Center for the Edge in Deloitte. And in my memory of it, they did like a decade of work. They were seeing some interesting things going on in the manufacturing industries in Asia. And they wrote a bunch of kind of technical papers, and they wrote something kind of academic that brought it all together. And then they wrote a popular press book that I think is just called Shaping Strategy. And you know, you were talking about like, you know, attractors and this and that, but just kind of like practically, if you actually have a context and you have something you're trying to shift, it's a nice framework for understanding how you can have leverage and align a bunch of players so that you're all kind of like rowing in the same direction, and doing it with influence instead of authority. So I found that very helpful.
Yeah, that's amazing. I haven't heard of Centre for the Edge, but I'll definitely look it up. But that is the approach we're using. So we've developed software and all the software really is we've taken those complex systems leadership theories and looked for characteristics that encourage that shift. And so our software has got these stages that go with this natural shift that's shown in the research. And all it does is it identifies those kind of characteristics in initiatives in ecosystems. So I'd say we're very similar with regards to the approach with regards to shaping, like not controlling, but just actually shaping systems to help them with regards to transitions. And that's the kind of work we do. Definitely interested to having a look at this Centre for the Edge. That sounds like fascinating. With regards to the design, there's quite a bit of work happening on systems design. I was in Italy a couple of months ago at the last systems design conference. And so I think they call it systemic design. So there's a paper by Buchanan, 1992, that talks about design. There's been these 4 areas of design, and this area of systems design. And so they're actually looking at the combination of systems thinking and complexity and design thinking together with regards to addressing more complex problems. A lot of the focus is on a more cause and effect type systems thinking because they want to be able to design it. And so I've written a paper for that. Well, I'm in the process of writing a paper for the proceedings for that conference, which is looking at a more of a complexity theory, adaptive approach that aligns with design as well. And the other area which is quite interesting is labs. I did a research project a few months ago which looked at the different kinds of labs, the living labs, the urban labs, the public sector innovation labs, the transition labs. There's so many types of labs. And I did a paper looking at all of those different labs and looking at what characteristics they've had for addressing wicked problems. And then came up with a new lab model called a systemic innovation lab. And it's been quite interesting with regards to this approach that I've been taking with doing the research, writing the paper, getting the paper published and commercialising. What's starting to happen is the commercialising is happening before the paper's published. So we've got, the paper only got published a couple of months ago, but we've got 2 of these labs on the ground, which is quite interesting. So we've got a food insecurity lab that Edith Cowan University is running in Western Australia, and we're just about to do a climate change lab in South Australia, which has taken quite a while with regards, because it's state local government. So yeah, really interesting stuff happening in the design space for sure. And it sounds like, with regards to what you're saying about the shaping strategies, and this is what's made, I guess, what made me really quite excited about all of this. And it was actually mentioned in a book on complexity and management. Like, it was one of like the big, like, I don't know if it was a Springer series of books or something, but it actually said that how to do this is known. Like, people know how to do this transition stuff. It is about that shaping and moving along. And so everything I was reading was saying the same thing. And I'm like, and because so many people were saying, hey, we need to actually shape these, just tweak this to help the movements with regards to transitions. And it was coming from sustainable development. It was coming from urban planning. It was coming from the leadership and management. And when you start seeing all of these fields independently start saying the same stuff, you kind of think, oh, they're onto something here. And so, yeah, I'm finding it really exciting. Thank you. And I will definitely be looking up the Centre for the Edge. It sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things, thank you, Rob, I loved how you circled around to that. The Center for Edge and the work that Hagel and John Seeley Brown are doing is really pretty remarkable. And he does have John has a great blog that's worth following as well. But one of the things that I think has come up across this conversation is that it really is complexity is now becoming the I think of it as the add-on, but it's really the umbrella across any of the existing models, strategies, management practices, organizational tools, and strategic initiatives. And what Plexus has been finding, and what I've been finding in my work, is that people are just saying, we know that we need to understand what complexity is and how to integrate it or to use it as we're addressing our existing capabilities, competencies, and organizational structures and, projects, etc. And I keep saying to everybody, it's not the replacement, it's the way in which you're just adding this additional lens. And that's really,
definitely, I'm the same. I'm definitely the same.
Exactly. And that's where the whole thing is that it doesn't mean if you're doing one particular kind of work or you're in one particular type of profession, but it's being able to have that conversation where there's this commonality of, I think of it as language and thinking. I mean, that's why we always use the word complexity thinking, because you can be a process improvement person, you can be HR, you can be manufacturing, you can be engineering, you can be a number of different things. But as soon as you have the commonality of recognizing the tenets of what a complex adaptive system is and how to start to think about that from a pattern-based perspective, all of a sudden you're starting to have these commonalities of language, and you're able to do things in this more adaptive, iterative way where you recognize that the outcomes are going to lead to the next step. Thank you for smiling, because it's like, oh yes, so we can plug ourselves in anywhere. Right.
And this is what I found, like, when I started going to international conferences. They just kept growing because I was going to all these different sectors, and it was the same conversation. You know what I mean? It didn't matter if I was going to public management or political studies or to planning or education for sustainability or social innovation. It didn't matter where I was going. I was having the same conversations with people that were taking a lens on what they were looking at, and it was just wonderful. It was starting to get very expensive though, but it was just wonderful.
So anyway, we've had this sort of like just great little love fest here. But for everybody else, please tell us what some of the things that you're thinking about, and some of the things you're working on. Is there anybody on the call or in the pop-up now who might be interested in participating in the conference or sharing other types of conversations of this nature? I'm going to mute myself.
Yeah. Over the last few years, I did some work for the Department of Public Health here in Philadelphia, and I'm not an academic. I'm kind of a practitioner who thinks too much. And I was talking to a public health academic who was encouraging me to write the project up, and the way we're talking about doing work, excuse my grammar, are the principles I was using to get that work done. I was hired by the Department of Public Health to find a set of people who they didn't know who they were or how to engage them. There were multiple stakeholders and lots of different interests. I proceeded definitely with the idea of kind of like I want to use the terminology right, but let's say putting feelers out and then following things as they evolved. The notion of a wicked problem where there's something you actually have to fix and you know it's not going to work, so you do need to come up with an actual solution, but the center of gravity is really the collective of people and know-how and relationships that can continue solving problems because you need to continue solving problems. I used, for one part of the project, some basic kind of human-centered design, service design methods, but wrap that up in other things. I don't know if you all have crossed paths with David Snowden and Knevin and Cynthia Kurtz. So I worked with them when I was at IBM and have worked with them since. So at the beginning of every consulting, a lot of the time when people talk complexity, it sounds kind of abstract and mathematical, but a huge amount of it is meaning making and metaphor and frame conflict and that sort of stuff. So I do some participatory narrative sense making exercises at the beginning of all the projects that I do, so that we can all get in the same kind of, well, either get in the same conceptual and emotional space, or at least understand the ways in which we are not in the same conceptual and emotional space. So I might be writing that up. It does seem like it would fit in your conference.
It does, and I must admit, I'm not a heavy theoretical person, and it was quite funny last year. I presented this paper, and I ended up getting the giggles halfway through it because I just couldn't believe it was me presenting this, because it was all the ontology and epistemology, and it was just so not me. But we picked up this model that was used, this frame that was used in organisational development and complexity. And they look at their field within levels, and they looked at all the publications that had been made in the field, and it ranged from this idea of like models through to like metaphors, and so we started looking at this space. It's so broad, and we wanted to, and there's another paper by ISIRC, which I mentioned earlier, which talks about perceived and descriptive complexity, and the perceived is very much about perceiving a situation as complex, and how do you bring people together to take action knowing that this is this way. And then you've got and it's very subjective, and then you've got your descriptive complexity, which sees a system which has intrinsic properties, and how do you move that. So there is different ways of using complexity with regards to addressing issues, and we take a very big tent approach in the stream. And it was funny because Christine and I both attended the Adelphi University, so we had our own, we were in our own box with regards to what this was. And then the first year we ran the complexity stream, Christine and I were looking at each other going, oh, is that complexity? Because it was not our background, and so that has caused me to go in and to have a broader look. So I'm into a big tent kind of looking at this area, because I think there's lots to learn from each other when people are using different approaches. So please send in an abstract.
Okay, and I'm very interested in learning more about what you're doing on the ground and kind of how you're thinking about it and what you're writing up. Actually, I should make that a question. What of yours should I read first to understand your work?
Well, Wicked Lab is the complexity focused business that I've co-founded, and on there we've got a publication page which has got some of the publications. I've written up the model that underpins our software from before it was software, but I think at the end of that paper I was saying, oh, and this is going to be turned into software. And then I've written up a paper with how this approach could be used for food insecurity, which is it's kind of like got that theoretical, this is the theory, this is how I've taken all of the stuff out of complex systems leadership theory, but this is how it would be used for a particular wicked problem. So it came across very well for practitioners within the food, looking at food issues, complex food issues with regards to food insecurity, food waste, those sorts of areas. So I've written up a paper in that area. I've recently had a paper published on systemic innovation labs, but I guess I'm currently at the state of writing up case studies. So now we're starting to get some things happening on the ground. But to be honest, what we did is we kind of like. I'm glad we did it the way we did it, but it didn't work. But I'm glad we did it the way we did it. We developed the software first. Realised that running around town with a software program that's based on complexity science wasn't really user friendly. So we had to develop an education program around it. And so that we've had people go through our education program, which uses our software as project-based learning. But then they weren't really engaging with communities. There was nothing really, nothing in that. They could look from their ivory tower and say, oh, that looks like that. And so then we actually developed a lab methodology. And so now we're at the stage of having labs on the ground. And that's where we're going to actually get results, because we've actually got core teams of diverse people coming together who are actually governing this process of working in communities and looking at all of the initiatives, the existing initiatives that are going on, and looking at how they're contributing towards systems change. So not only looking at you could look at what you're doing with regards to how you're addressing the part of the problem that you're looking at, but now the software actually helps them, and the lab process helps them look across as a whole system. And so now we'll be able to start getting case studies. We've got a particular one, a state government and local government one, that's going to start early next year. And because that one's in South Australia where I live, I am going to be so on them. I'll be fine. They're going to be so sick of me, because I want to write that one up as a case study. Where we've got this other one that's happening over in Western Australia, but it's very distant from us. Where the one in South Australia, we've had 20 staff from the state government department come through our training program. So it's been quite well resourced, and we've got a very good relationship with them. We've been working with them for a few years, so I'm looking very forward to writing that one up. So I have got a bit to read, and if you're really keen, there's the whole PhD thesis, which I'm really quite pleased with, because I did my PhD in partnership with a local authority, and my PhD thesis is available in all the public libraries. So it's available in the public libraries for this particular local authority, so that citizens can read my PhD thesis. But also, because we have this one card system, any citizen can go into their public library and order in my PhD thesis. So it's very available.
I'm happy to jump in. My name's Tom Malarkey. It's my first time on this. Although I've been getting the Plexus newsletter for some time, and I've had intentions for years now to join something. So did. I work here in Oakland, California with the National Equity Project, and we're a nonprofit, and we support education organizations, school districts, foundations sometimes, nonprofits, youth-serving organizations, basically to put equity and racial equity in particular at the center of their change efforts. And so we've been doing this for some time, 20, 25 years now, and our approach has continued to evolve. And about 10 years ago, we got onto complexity, and some of us started to realize that it had as radical implications for our work as just the notion of understanding equity and systemic oppression has for someone's way of thinking about the world. And that many of the ways that the types of equity challenges that schools and school systems and youth-serving organizations face inevitably are complex at their core, and that the default ways of approaching these complex challenges, so people use the language of the achievement gap or whatever, often defaults to strategies that are in the complicated realm inappropriately, and people want to come up with various types of checklists about, the things that they think are going to move the dial on outcomes for kids. And as well, people have started to realize it's not just about our external strategies with our stakeholders, those we serve, but how do we internally come to understand and reckon with the implications of equity and identity, and how we are all, our views and our ways of being are shaped by historical systemic oppression. And so, so people want complicated strategies to do that. What book should I read? Internal learning activities should we do? Check, check, check. Do we have an equity policy? Do we have an equity lens? And so we just realized that a lot of the ways that we were failing to make progress in supporting some of the organizations that we work with to wrestle with the deeper equity challenges that they face had to do with complexity. And so we have been doing our learning, and we have built it into we have a Leading for Equity framework, because we're a leadership development in service of equity-centered systems change. So we have a leadership framework that now has equity and complexity, and recently we have added a version of design thinking to that framework that we developed in conjunction with folks at the D School at Stanford that we have are calling liberatory design.
Nice.
It is, it's kind of regular design thinking doesn't necessarily get you far enough in some of the complex challenges, nor does it automatically provide your so-called solutions for equity challenges either. So we're really interested in this territory and talking more with people beyond ourselves. In the realm of education, we find that we're often the first time that anyone has heard about complexity.
Tom, this is actually what a group within Plexus is struggling with at this point. Without going into what we're doing, describing it, we have an environmental health social platform that we're developing. And one of the things that we realized was that we didn't want to replicate existing social biases, economic inequality, racial, ethnic, and gender inequality into a new platform. Because you get Wikipedia, you get Facebook, you get other kinds of platforms. They're not designed with the intentionality of recreating social ills, but they end up doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we're having another pop-up. The first, I think, Denise, is the first Wednesday in January. You can find it on the Plexus website where we're going to be talking and strategizing how to, as we socially innovate, how to avoid, even if we take a complexity systems approach, how do we avoid replicating unintentionally the social ills that we're trying to solve?
That's really good. There's, I think, I'm just thinking with myself, because starting up a software firm with my co-founder, we were finding ourselves going to all of these like startup type of events, and there was this culture of, and we're thinking, oh, you know, it's not quite fitting our value system. So it was really having to take a step back and think, you know, like, you know, what is it that we value? And my co-founder has got very young children, and I've got a grandson, and family is important to us. And, you know, but looking at a lot of these models that are coming through now with regards to business models, some of them are quite scary with regards to where workers' rights are, you know, the lack of thinking about workers' lifestyles, etc. So yeah, very, very important areas when you're starting to think of new ways of working, for sure. With regards to what Tom was saying, also that idea of like working at that intermediary level, and working with, so you've got like this work happening in communities, and then you've got like this other layer, another area which I've come to value the importance of, to the extent that I've actually been quoted as saying, I don't think the complexity part is that hard. I think it's the interface between the complexity part and our traditional bureaucratic systems is the hard part with regards to working. So that's another area that we focus on, is actually how do you encourage this to work in a way where governments can work this way and where bureaucracies can work this way. And I think that is another vital part of work. And so we've been getting into the research and practice in that as well, because you can have this way of working over there, but unless it's unless it can fit with these traditional structures, which really fits in with the next Plexus conversation in a way as well in January, is it can't be something, an add-on over here way of working that's nice over there. If it's going to be taken up, it's got to be taken up where it fits within the interface between existing systems. I think is really important. So we do with our software, we've got like 9 focus areas, and only 5 of them are on transitions. The other 4 focus on working with government, both elected members, the politicians, 2 focus on with politicians, and 2 with regards to bureaucracies. But we're actually working on a project with a large successful company in Australia right now, and we're just exploring, because it's not the social area. It's a mining company, and so they're going through our program right now, and we're looking at that governance area that we've developed, which focuses on politicians and bureaucracy, public administrators, and we're looking at how that can be used in other situations when you've got like a governing board. Know what I mean? So the governing board isn't squashing this way of working through their normal need to keep everybody accountable, etc. So I guess there's this realist part with regards to how we're working, in that this is what's needed for complex problems, but that's not how governance works. So how do we actually manage that interface between the two? I think is a really important area. And I kind of like fell into that. My background is working with citizens on large-scale urban regeneration projects, and I got in strife with the government because the citizens were going one way and it wasn't the way the government wanted to go, and it all got awfully squashed, came down on me like a ton of bricks with regards to, if government doesn't want you working a certain way, they soon put things in place to stop you. So it really made me realise the importance of, you know, creating conditions for things to emerge. Is so important with regards to working in communities on complex issues. But there's this reality tap, that there's this governance framework framework that we all work under, and that interface is really important. So yeah, throw in there.
Two things sort of popped up as you were chatting, and every time we have one of these conversations, I'm really excited because there's so many intersections. Tom, one of the things that Plexus has done is it worked with the Gates Foundation on a very large project to introduce and then work in school systems with something called adaptive positive deviance. The work of positive deviance is really very cool. It came originally out of Plexus, and then Monique and Jerry Sternin, and it was at that intersection of social innovation, but from it was, how do you work with the groups, and how do you look at some ways in which to use engagement as sort of the core initiative of starting to change the behaviors within complex systems. So I'm happy to share with you, Tom, any information that we have about that, because it's very cool, and there are a lot of people within our network who are doing work in that area. And the other thing is, it dawns on me every time we have one of these conversations, it's really to have sort of a practitioner's sort of just open conversation. So I'm thinking that maybe in January we use, in addition to having, so Tom, I sort of think maybe I've convinced you and Rob possibly, and anybody else, to do a pop-up, because this is what it is. It's just meeting colleagues and then finding the connections. And it all starts with, here's what we're working on. And then, as you can see, it goes in a multitude of different directions. But maybe if we can get enough people, we could do, a monthly conversation. And so we could bring problems or whatever, and we can clearly try to find the opportunities to maybe, collaborate on projects and share information. And if there's large projects, maybe even be able to, do joint, proposals and presentations. So I'm thinking that there's something emerging on that. And I'm going to keep it open. We can go for as long as everybody wants. I do try to be respectful for time, time considerations of keeping it at about an hour. But Sharon and everybody who's on the call, please feel free to keep talking, and whenever you think, Sharon's the right time to wrap up, we'll wrap up. How's that?
Yeah. Well, I just want to say it's been so lovely. I mean, I'm a bit like, I think it was Tom who's been on the newsletter getting the newsletter for quite a few years, and but hasn't actually engaged at this kind of level. So it's been such a pleasure to actually finally come onto the call, and I wish I'd done it a long time ago, because it's so nice to have a discussion with practitioners who are out there actually doing stuff. So thank you for the opportunity, Denise. It's just been lovely, and it's been lovely meeting everyone on the call as well.
Absolutely.
And please think about coming to the conference. So it's in September, so it's September 2nd to 4th, and the call for abstracts closed 28th of February. And you never know, Plexus might want to do a panel. You can actually do a panel, so you could actually get a few of your projects up as a panel. Would be quite interesting.
Oh, hint. I like that. Mike, are you hearing this?
I'm totally hearing it, but it's, you know how much we have going on.
We do.
I already have 3 conferences between now and April. So
this is until September. It could be in your slow period.
Okay.
I know, and I just, this is just a little tiny plug for Plexus. We over the last year, literally a group of catalysts have come together and said, how do we fit into the thinking and work and needs of people, organizations, researchers, academics, practitioners today? And we open it up as to all volunteer network, and we were going to try, and we are practicing what we preach, and to see what emerges. And we have self-organized into some amazing projects, as Mike explained. You can go onto the site and you can see it. And that is part of what's been so exciting, because Plexus has been around for almost 20 years. And for those of you who've, had some kind of connection to Plexus, I mean, Jeffrey Goldstein, I mean, we have amazing resources of people who didn't have a place in a community where they could sort of introduce and share their ideas about complexity. And now what's happened is I think complexity has really just exploded out of the box, and it's not limited or restricted. The constraints of how and who can talk about it have been lifted.
Yeah,
so you can be an artist, you can be an educator, you can be a researcher, you can be someone who's working in a manufacturing environment. I've done a lot of work with manufacturers. And as soon as you start to help people recognize and understand and share the things that they don't necessarily know how to articulate, it's like they're so excited because it gives them that capability to communicate things that are really difficult. And I think we're all working really at the edge of how everything and everybody's going to be thinking about things. And that's amazingly fun and just a pleasure to be in conversation with everybody. Thank you, Sharon. I know we're going to be doing some really cool things with you and Plexus.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm really pleased with the opportunity to connect this way, and I look forward to furthering the discussions with Plexus. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.
And I look forward to our next interaction.
Absolutely. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and we'll send it out to everybody. But do know you're welcome to stay on for a little bit more. Okay, great.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.